The wind clawed at the leaded windows of Ashford Manor like a thing alive. In the oak-panelled study, Viscount Harold Ashford sat slumped across his desk, a crystal tumbler overturned, the air thick with the scent of bitter almonds. The door was bolted from within, the windows were fastened. The key remained in the lock on the inside, yet the Viscount was very certainly dead, poisoned by prussic acid, on a night when every soul in the house could swear no one had entered that room after 11 o'clock, and in the hallway, waiting with perfect composure, stood a small man with an egg-shaped head and magnificent moustaches. Hercule Poirot had arrived. Chapter 1. The Summons from Scotland Yard. The telegram arrived at precisely 23 minutes past 9 on a morning so drenched in London fog that even the gas lamps in Whitehaven mansions seemed to drown in their own halos. Poirot was at breakfast, dissecting a brioche with the solemnity of a surgeon, when the page boy knocked and presented the orange envelope on a silver tray, as though it were the crown jewels. Poirot slit it open with a fruit knife, read the few lines, and permitted himself the smallest elevation of one eyebrow, an earthquake by his standards. Mon Dieu, he murmured, passing the paper across the tablecloth to me. It appears, Hastings, that the English aristocracy has once again managed to get itself murdered in a manner that defies the possible. We are required in Surrey without delay. The message was signed simply Jap and contained the terse economy that characterized all communications from Scotland Yard's finest when they found themselves out of their depth. Locked room, poisoning Ashford Manor, Dr. Leatherhead. Viscount Harold Ashford dead in bolted study. Prussic acid. No entry possible. Family in hysterics. Come at once. I felt a familiar tingle along my spine that always accompanied the promise of one of Poirot's little problems. Within 10 minutes, we were descending in the lift, Poirot immaculate in a dove-grey overcoat and carrying the Malacca cane with the jade handle that he affected in the country, while I struggled into my British warm and tried to look as though I had not been roused from a second cup of coffee. Outside, the great Napier was already purring at the curb, its long bonnet gleaming like a black salmon. Poirot's chauffeur touched his cap and held the door. As we swept down through the slow tide of traffic toward Westminster Bridge, Poirot gazed out at the shrouded river and began to talk, half to me, half to the fog itself. Consider Hastings, the delicious simplicity of the locked room. A man is found dead. Every door is fastened from within. Every window is barred or bolted. No chimney admits a human form. No secret passage has been discovered. And yet the man is poisoned. The English police, they are admirable in many ways, but when confronted by the impossible, they become like bulls who see red but cannot find. The matador. They require the little grey cells. He tapped his forehead delicately. Tell me, my friend, when you hear locked room and prussic acid, what is the first image that presents itself to your mind? Suicide, I suppose, I said at once. The fellow took the poison himself, locked the door so no one would interfere, and that was that. Poirot shook his head with gentle pity. Always you leap, Hastings, like the gallant kangaroo, and yet suicide is the one explanation that is most often impossible. For consider, prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide to the chemists, kills within seconds. The agony is brief but intense. The victim has no time to hide the file, to wash the glass, to arrange the body with decency. And yet in these cases, the room is always immaculately tidy. The poison container vanished. Non, non, mon ami. When a man locks himself in to die, he does not trouble to remove the evidence. only a murderer troubles to do that. We were crossing the Thames now, the water the color of tarnished pewter beneath us. Poirot leaned back against the Moroccan leather and closed his eyes. Moreover, he continued dreamily, prussic acid has the odor of bitter almonds, a distinctive perfume. One does not mistake it, and it is rare, kept only in laboratories or by those who have need of it for photography or perhaps the extermination of wasps. Our Viscount, I think, was not a photographer. By the time we left the suburbs behind and entered the winding lanes of Surrey, the fog had thinned to a pearly haze, and the beeches were turning bronze and copper along the hedges. Ashford Manor lay some 3 miles beyond Leatherhead, reached by a private drive that curved for nearly a mile between avenues of ancient oaks. Even from a distance, the house presented a forbidding aspect. 3 stories of mellow Elizabethan brick, dressed with later Georgian additions, tall chimneys, and a slate roof the color of wet iron. Black crape already fluttered from the flagstaff, though the Viscount had been dead less than 36 hours. A young constable saluted nervously as we drew up before the portico. Inside, the great hall was dim and smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and something else, something sharp and medicinal that caught at the back of the throat. Inspector Japp detached himself from a knot of plainclothesmen near the staircase and came toward us with the air of a man who has not slept. "Thank heaven you're here, Monsieur Poirot," he said, without preamble. "I've got the chief constable breathing down my neck, the family threatening to call in the Home Secretary, and a corpse in a room that no one could have entered or left. I'm at my wit's end." Poirot inclined his head with sympathy. "Calm yourself, mon cher Japp. The impossible happens only because we have not yet perceived the possible. Conduct us first to the family. It is always wise to observe the lions before one enters the cage." Japp led us through a baize door and along a corridor panelled in dark oak. Portraits of long-dead Ashfords glowered down at us, soldiers in buff coats, judges in full-bottomed wigs. One admiral with a face like a walnut. At the far end, a door stood ajar, and from within came the low murmur of voices and the occasional sob. We entered the drawing room, a lofty apartment furnished in the French style, with delicate gilt chairs that looked quite incapable of supporting human weight. 5 people turned to stare at us, as though we were a traveling circus arrived without invitation. Lady Clarissa Ashford stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as though for support. She was perhaps 40, tall, with the kind of bone structure that photographers worship and the kind of pallor that comes from sleepless nights rather than nature. Her black dress was perfectly cut, her pearls perfectly matched, and her eyes perfectly hard. Dr. Miles Ravencroft, the family physician and cousin to the dead man, hovered protectively at her elbow. He was a thin, nervous man in his late 40s, with a pointed beard and the stoop of one who spends too much time bending over bedsides. His fingers drummed incessantly against his thigh. On a sofa near the window sat Miss Delia Frost, the Viscount's secretary. She was young, 25 at most, with ash-blonde hair drawn back severely, and the kind of translucent skin that shows every emotion. At the moment, her emotion appeared to be terror, barely held in check. Sprawled in an armchair with a whiskey glass dangling from one hand was Mr. Reginald Thorne, universally known as Reggie, the Viscount's nephew and heir presumptive under the previous will. He was handsome in a dissolute way, with the flushed cheeks and trembling hands of a man who has already had several drinks before luncheon. Finally, standing a little apart as though not quite certain of his right to be there at all, was the butler Grimshaw. He had the face of a Roman emperor fallen on hard times, granite features, thin lips, eyes that had seen everything and approved of very little. Poirot advanced into the room with the air of a cardinal entering a conclave. He bowed to Lady Clarissa. Madame, accept the profound sympathy of Hercule Poirot. It is a tragedy that brings me here, but also a duty. The truth must be served, even when it is painful. Lady Clarissa regarded him with the expression of one who has smelled something slightly unpleasant. We have already given statements to the police, she said coldly. 3 times. I fail to see what a foreigner can add. Poirot's smile did not waver. Madame, it is precisely because I am a foreigner that I see clearly. The English, you are too polite. You see what you expect to see. I see only what is there. He turned to the room at large. Perhaps one of you would be so kind as to tell me, in your own words, exactly what occurred on the night Lord Ashford died. There was a moment of frozen silence. Then Reggie Thorne laughed, a cracked, unpleasant sound. Happy to oblige, old boy. Uncle Harold had one of his bilious attacks after dinner. Said he was going to work in his study and didn't want to be disturbed. Grimshaw took him his brandy at 11. Door was locked at 11:15. We all went to bed, or pretended to. Next morning, Grimshaw couldn't get an answer. Had to break the door down. Found Uncle dead at his desk. Smelled like a chemist's shop. That's the lot. Poirot's eyes moved from face to face. And none of you heard anything unusual during the night? No cry, no sound of a fall. 5 heads shook in unison. Curious, Poirot murmured. Prussic acid acts swiftly, yes, but not silently. There is always a gasp, a convulsion, yet the house slept undisturbed. Dr. Ravencroft cleared his throat. Harold had been taking laudanum for his nerves. A heavy dose would have rendered him unconscious almost immediately. The poison would have done its work without waking him. Poirot's gaze fixed upon the doctor like a pin through a butterfly. You prescribed this laudanum, doctor? Naturally. I have been attending Harold for years. And you keep prussic acid in your dispensary? Ravencroft flushed. I keep many things. One does not murder one's patients, Monsieur Poirot. Not ordinarily, no. But then, ordinarily, one's patients do not threaten to cut one out of their will. Lady Clarissa gave a sharp intake of breath. Reggie Thorne sat up straighter, suddenly sober. Delia Frost pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Poirot spread his hands in apology. Pardon, I shock you. But we deal here with facts, not sensibilities. I am informed that Lord Ashford intended to execute a new will within the week. A will that would have disinherited certain persons in this room and enriched others. Money, mesdames et messieurs, is the most common motive for murder, and the most dangerous to ignore. He turned suddenly to Grimshaw. You, Monsieur le Butler, you have been 40 years in this house. 42, sir. You knew his lordship better than anyone. I like to think I knew my duty, sir. Admirable. Then tell me, when you brought the brandy tray at 11 o'clock, did his lordship seem his usual self? Grimshaw hesitated. The smallest fraction. He was quieter than usual, sir. Said he had much to think about. Told me not to wait up. And the brandy? You poured it yourself? From the decanter in the library, as always. His lordship disliked the ritual of decanters in the study. Said they encouraged him to drink too much. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Yet on his desk this morning, the police found a decanter, almost empty, and a single glass. How do you explain that? For the first time, the butler's granite mask cracked. I cannot explain it, sir, unless his lordship fetched it himself later. From a locked library? At 11 o'clock at night? Come, come, my friend. Doors do not unlock themselves. Lady Clarissa's voice cut across the room like a whip. Are we to be subjected to this interrogation indefinitely? My husband is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing you say or do will bring him back. Poirot bowed profoundly. On the contrary, madame, everything I do is designed to let him rest in peace by giving his murderer no peace at all. He turned to Jap. Inspector, I have seen enough for the moment. Conduct me now to the study. It is there, among the bitter almonds, that the truth awaits us. As we left the drawing room, I glanced back once. 5 faces watched us go. 5 masks behind, which I was suddenly certain at least one murderer hid. The game, as my friend Sherlock Holmes would have said, was afoot, and somewhere in that silent house, a clock was ticking toward a revelation none of us could yet imagine. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. Inspector Japp led us along a corridor that smelled of cedar and old money, past suits of armor that had guarded the passage since the Armada, until we reached a heavy oak door bound with black iron. A constable stood to attention beside a jagged hole where the lock had been forced. Yellow police tape fluttered like a funeral ribbon. Japp lifted it with the reverence of a verger and ushered us inside. The study at Ashford Manor was a room that belonged to another century. Dark paneling rose to a plaster ceiling, rich with strapwork and pendant bosses. A vast stone fireplace yawned beneath a carved-over mantel, displaying the Ashford arms impaled with those of some long-forgotten heiress. Above it hung a Van Dyck portrait of a cavalier ancestor, whose eyes seemed to follow us with sardonic interest. The windows, tall and narrow, were still shuttered against the night of the murder, and only a single green-shaded desk lamp burned, throwing a pool of light across the desk, where Viscount Ashford had breathed his last. He lay as he had fallen, head and shoulders slumped forward over a morocco writing surface, one arm outstretched, as though reaching for something just beyond the edge of the world. The other hand still loosely clasped the stem of a crystal tumbler that had overturned, leaving a dark stain that had soaked into the blotter. His evening clothes were immaculate: white tie, perfectly creased trousers, patent shoes reflecting the lamplight like black mirrors. Only the face destroyed the illusion of a man merely asleep. It was congested, almost purple, the lips drawn back in a rictus that was half snarl, half grin, and from the open mouth came that faint, unmistakable sweetness of bitter almonds. Poirot stood quite still for a long moment, absorbing the room the way a musician absorbs a concert hall before lifting the baton. Then he moved, silent on the thick Turkey carpet, and began his examination with the meticulous care of a watchmaker. First the door. He ran gloved fingers along the bolt, tested its weight, peered at the screws. Old but solid, he murmured. Turned from the inside, and the key remains in the lock, also on the inside. No sign of tampering. He knelt, brought his lens to bear on the key itself. No scratches. Whoever turned this key did so with the proper instrument and without haste. Next, the windows. There were 3, each with internal shutters, fastened by iron bars that dropped into stone sockets. He opened one pair, stepped out onto the narrow balcony that ran beneath, and examined the leads for footprints. The rain of 2 nights ago had washed everything clean. He closed the shutters again, refastened the bar, and nodded to himself. From a waistcoat pocket, he produced a small electric torch and directed its beam along the wainscot, under the desk, behind the heavy leather armchairs. Nothing. No file, no packet, no discarded syringe. The poison had vanished as completely as the hand that administered it. Jap watched him with the expression of a man who has seen this performance before and still cannot quite believe it. "We've been over every inch," he said defensively. "Fingerprint powder, magnifying glasses, the lot. The only prints are his lordship's own. On the glass, the decanter, the pen he was holding when he died. And that decanter, Monsieur Poirot. That's the queerest thing of all. Grimshaw swears blind there was no decanter in this room when he brought the single glass of brandy at 11. Yet there it stands, cut crystal, 3/4 empty, with a residue that matches the stuff in his lordship's stomach." Poirot approached the desk. The decanter was indeed handsome, Regency, with a silver label marked Brandy in flowing script. He lifted the stopper, sniffed delicately, then tilted the vessel so that the lamplight caught the faint sediment at the bottom. "Curious," he said softly. "This sediment is not the lees of brandy. It is crystalline. Potassium cyanide, perhaps, imperfectly dissolved. And observe the ring inside the neck, distinct, as though the decanter stood unused for many years and then was suddenly pressed into service." He set it down exactly as he had found it. "Someone, mon ami, brought this decanter here after Grimshaw's visit. Someone who had a key, or who did not need one." He moved to the fireplace. A coal fire had burned low, but the ashes were still warm beneath the grate. With a small poker, he stirred them gently, then drew something forth, a scrap of paper, half consumed, the edges charred to lace. Carefully he laid it on the hearth and deciphered the remaining words. "Cannot endure the shame. Forgive me, Harold." "A fragment of a suicide note," Jap suggested. "Or the fragment of a forgery," Poirot replied. "We shall see." He slipped the scrap into an envelope. Now he turned his attention to the desk itself. Papers lay scattered, bills, a half-finished letter to his solicitor, a list of investments. The letter was revealing. It began, "My dear Enderby," and continued in a firm, decisive hand. "By the time you receive this, I shall have taken steps to ensure that my daughter receives what is rightfully hers. Clarissa must not be allowed to." There it broke off, the nib of the fountain pen still resting where the writer had let it fall. Beside the blotter lay a small pearl, perfectly round, faintly luminous in the lamplight. Poirot picked it up with tweezers and held it to the lens. "From a necklace," he said. "The thread is freshly broken. Yet Lady Clarissa, I observed, wears her pearls intact. Whose necklace, then, mourns the loss of a single pearl in this room where no woman is admitted after dinner?" He pocketed the pearl and stood for a long moment, gazing at the body. Then, with infinite gentleness, he lifted the dead man's right hand. Beneath the cuff protruded a corner of stiff paper. Poirot drew it out. An envelope addressed in a feminine hand to "My darling papa." Inside was a single sheet. "You promised me everything would be made right. If you fail me now, I shall never forgive you, not even beyond the grave." D. Delia Frost's handwriting. I recognized it from the typing she had done for his lordship. Poirot replaced the letter exactly as he had found it, then stepped back and surveyed the room once more, his eyes gleaming like green ice. "Behold the stage, Hastings," he said quietly. "A man sits alone, writes of justice for his daughter, drinks brandy from a decanter that should not exist, and dies in agony while the door remains bolted from within. Somewhere in this pretty tableau lies the truth, and Hercule Poirot will find it if he must take the house apart, stone by stone. He turned to Jap. For now, mon inspector, have the body removed to the mortuary, but touch nothing else. Tonight, I wish to sit here alone, in the dark, and listen to what this room has to tell me. Sometimes, you understand, the silence speaks louder than any witness. As we left the study, the wind rose, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers demanding entrance. Somewhere in the great house, a clock struck 4, and I felt the chill of more than autumn in my bones. The scent of bitter almonds lingered in the air long after the door had closed behind us. Chapter 3: 5 Motives in the Firelight. Dinner that evening was a travesty of civilized behavior. The great dining table, which could have seated 30 with ease, had been laid for 7. The silver epergnes filled with black grapes and late roses that seemed already to be decaying. Candles guttered in the draught that found its way through every chink in the Elizabethan windows, and the portraits of dead Ashfords looked down upon their living descendants with expressions of refined contempt. Nobody spoke unless spoken to, and then only in monosyllables. The soup cooled untouched. The salmon might have been sawdust. The claret circulated like blood no one wished to drink. Poirot, seated at Lady Clarissa's right in the place of honor that should have been the dead man's, observed everything with the bright, unblinking gaze of a robin watching worms. He ate delicately, praised the Chateau Margaux with genuine appreciation, and waited. When the covers had been removed and the servants dismissed with the port and nuts, he rose to his feet with the air of a conjurer about to produce a rabbit from a hat. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice soft, yet carrying to every corner of the panelled room. It is not my custom to prolong suspense. Tomorrow, the coroner will bring in a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Tonight, while we are all gathered beneath this roof, Hercule Poirot will lay before you the pieces of the puzzle. Some of you will recognize your own handiwork. One of you will recognize the noose. He placed both hands flat upon the gleaming mahogany. Let us begin with the simplest of all questions. Who profits? Lord Ashford intended to sign a new will on Monday next. The old will, executed in 1928, leaves the entailed estate to Mr. Reginald Thorne, the viscountcy being extinct in the direct line. The new will, drafted by Messrs. Enderby, and Enderby of Lincoln's Inn, leaves everything that is not entailed to Miss Delia Frost, together with a handsome trust for her maintenance. Lady Clarissa receives only the jointure settled upon her at marriage, 5,000 a year and the dower house. Dr. Ravenscroft, who has been borrowing from the capital for years, receives nothing. Mr. Thorne's gambling debts are not to be paid. The charities his lordship lately favoured are forgotten. Only Miss Frost, the acknowledged natural daughter, is enriched beyond the dreams of avarice. He paused. The silence was absolute. Even the candles seemed to burn without crackling. Money, Poirot continued, is the oldest motive in the world, but money alone does not open a bolted door. He turned to Lady Clarissa, who sat rigid as a statue carved from ice. Madame, you discovered your husband's infidelity many years ago. You endured it for the sake of position. Then you learned that the child of that infidelity was to supplant you. You have been heard to say, within the hearing of the kitchen maid, who has repeated it to the police, that you would rather see Harold dead than ruined by his bastard. You possess a bottle of perfume, La Nuit d'Amour, which the manufacturers flavor with oil of bitter almonds to suggest the presence of cyanide. The bottle is now empty. The laboratory will tell us tomorrow if traces of real cyanide were added to the perfume. Lady Clarissa's knuckles whitened on the stem of her glass, but she said nothing. Poirot's gaze moved to Dr. Ravenscroft. Doctor, you have been treating his lordship for what you call nervous dyspepsia. You prescribed laudanum in increasing doses. You keep potassium cyanide in your surgery for the destruction of wasps. Very convenient. You knew the combination of the safe where the new will was kept. You were seen by the second gardener leaving the house at 10 o'clock on the night of the murder, yet you told the police you were in your room all evening reading the Lancet. You needed the old will to remain unsigned. Otherwise, you would have been exposed as a thief and struck off the register. Ravenscroft opened his mouth, closed it again, and reached with a shaking hand for the decanter. Reggie Thorne gave a cracked laugh. Well, if we're all confessing, I might as well join the party. Uncle Harold had just paid my debts for the third and final time. £23,000 to a moneylender in Jermyn Street, who is not known for his patience. I was to be sent to Canada next month, like a disgraced remittance man. I came to the study that night to plead. He laughed at me, said I was a disgrace to the name. I lost my temper. I may have said I'd rather see him dead, but I didn't poison him. Dash it all, I'm not a complete cad. Delia Frost rose suddenly, her chair scraping back with a sound like a scream. You are all monsters, she said in a voice that trembled yet did not break. My father loved me. He was going to acknowledge me publicly. He told me so the very afternoon he died. He said, "Tomorrow everything changes, little one. Tomorrow you will be Lady Delia Ashford, in more than name." He kissed me on the forehead and gave me the pearl from his own stick-pin as a keepsake. That is the pearl you found on the desk, Monsieur Poirot. He must have dropped it when he realized what was happening to him. She held out her hand. On the palm lay a perfect pearl, the twin of the one Poirot had pocketed that afternoon. Poirot bowed very slightly. Mademoiselle, your grief does you credit, but grief can be simulated, and pearls can be bought in the Burlington Arcade for a few shillings. He turned last to Grimshaw, who had been standing behind Lady Clarissa's chair like a dark monument. And you, Monsieur le Maître d'Hôtel, 42 years of faithful service. You brought the nightly brandy at 11 o'clock precisely. You swear the tray held one glass only, poured from the library decanter. Yet in the study, we find a different decanter, almost empty, and a glass containing the dregs of poison. You have the keys to every room in the house. You knew his lordship's habits better than he knew them himself. You have been seen in Leatherhead purchasing photographic supplies. Cyanide is used in the darkroom, n'est-ce pas? And you have a son, I believe, who is not quite right in the head, and for whom a legacy would mean the difference between an asylum and a private nurse. Grimshaw's face did not change by a muscle. I have no son, sir, he said flatly, and I have never bought photographic supplies in my life. Poirot smiled, a small cat-like smile. Excellent. Denial is the first stage of confession. We shall see. He stepped back from the table and spread his hands. 5 motives, mes amis. 5 persons who wished Lord Ashford dead. Yet only one could have entered a bolted room and left it again without trace. Tomorrow I shall reconstruct the crime. Tonight I suggest you lock your doors, though I fear locks will avail you little when Hercule Poirot is on the scent. He bowed, turned on his heel, and left the room. The candles flickered wildly in the draught of his passage, and for a moment, the shadows on the walls seemed to twist into the shape of a noose. Somewhere in the great house, a clock began to strike 10, each chime falling into the silence like a coffin nail. The game had entered its second act, and none of us at that table would sleep easily again. Chapter 4. The Scent of Bitter Almonds. Long after the house had fallen into the uneasy hush that follows accusation, Poirot and I sat alone in the study, with only the dying fire for company. The shutters were closed, the green lamp extinguished, and the single candle he had placed upon the desk threw our shadows huge and wavering across the paneling. Somewhere in the walls, the old timbers creaked like a ship at anchor, and the wind outside prowled the terrace with the patience of a wolf. Poirot had drawn 2 armchairs close to the hearth. Between them stood the Regency brandy decanter, the fatal glass, and the small envelope containing the charred scrap of suicide note. He sat very still, hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed, the candle flame reflected in each pupil like twin points of green fire. I knew better than to disturb him when the little grey cells were at work, yet the silence grew so oppressive that at last I ventured a whisper. "You are certain it was not suicide then?" He did not open his eyes. "Certain." "Non Hastings, I am never certain until the moment of revelation. But suicide is lazy thinking, and Hercule Poirot is never lazy. Consider. A man who intends to kill himself does not write 2 letters, one to his solicitor announcing justice for his daughter, one supposedly confessing despair. He does not bring a second decanter into a room where brandy already waits. Above all, he does not hide the file with such artistry that the police of Scotland Yard cannot find it. He rose suddenly and crossed to the French windows. Throwing them open, he stepped out onto the balcony. Cold air swept in, making the candle gutter. I followed and found him kneeling, running his palm across the wet stone. "Observe," he said, voice low. "The rain has ceased, yet the balcony is still damp. 2 nights ago it rained without pause from 10 o'clock until dawn. Any footprint would have been washed away within minutes. Yet someone stood here. Hastings. Someone who did not wish to leave marks upon the carpet." He pointed to a faint, almost invisible smear along the inner edge of the sill, a discoloration no wider than a sixpence, darker than the surrounding lead. "Brandy," he murmured, "spilled in haste. And here." He produced his lens and bent close. A single thread of black silk caught upon the latch, from a lady's stocking perhaps, or from the glove of a careful murderer. We returned inside. Poirot closed the windows but did not fasten the shutters. Instead, he moved to the fireplace and with the poker very gently lifted the coals. Beneath lay a second scrap of paper, smaller than the first, its edges curled like black petals. He teased it out and held it to the candle. Only 3 words remained legible. "Beyond the grave." "The rest of the suicide note?" I breathed. "Or the rest of the forgery," he corrected. "Notice how the paper is heavier than the Ashford-crested notepaper upon the desk. This comes from a different source. Someone prepared this confession in advance and attempted to destroy it when the need for it vanished." He slipped the fragment into the envelope with its twin, and then, to my astonishment, began to undress the corpse. The Viscount still lay across the desk where rigor had fixed him. With surprising strength for so small a man, Poirot lifted the body back into the chair and unfastened the stiff shirt front. Around the dead man's neck, almost hidden by the wing collar, hung a thin gold chain. From it depended a tiny key. Ah, Poirot's satisfaction was the purr of a cat who has cornered the cream. The key to the private drawer. The police, they looked for a poison container, but not for what it might open. He inserted the key into a small drawer beneath the central pedestal of the desk. It turned sweetly. Inside lay a single folded sheet, heavy vellum, sealed with black wax, impressed by the Ashford crest. Poirot broke the seal and spread the paper beneath the candle. It was the new will, signed and witnessed 2 days before the murder by Grimshaw and the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. Everything to Delia Frost. A codicil, in the Viscount's own hand, added only yesterday, read, "Should I die by violence, before this instrument is probated, let no suspicion fall upon my daughter. She is innocent of all knowledge of my intentions." Poirot's eyes narrowed to slits. Behold, the motive reversed, Hastings. The Viscount feared murder, feared it enough to protect his child in advance. Yet he died in a room bolted from within. He replaced the will exactly as he had found it, closed the drawer, and returned the little key to its chain around the cold neck. Now we understand the terror in Miss Frost's eyes. She knew her father expected to be killed. She did not know he intended to die first, and in such a fashion that suspicion must fall upon the very persons who wished him dead. He moved to the fatal decanter and poured a finger of brandy into the poisoned glass. Holding it to the candle, he swirled gently, watching the crystalline sediment drift like snow. Potassium cyanide dissolves instantly in water, slowly in alcohol. Someone added the poison to the brandy long enough ago for partial solution, yet recent enough that grains remain. The decanter was prepared elsewhere and brought here after Grimshaw's departure at 11. But how? He set the glass down and crossed to the bookshelves that lined one wall. Running his fingers along the spines, mostly bound volumes of the Gentleman's Magazine and a complete set of Burke's Peerage, he suddenly pressed a small carved boss. A section of shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow cavity no wider than a man's shoulders. "A priest's hole," I exclaimed. "More recent than that," Poirot said. "Look, the hinges are modern, the wood lined with lead to deaden sound. A secret passage constructed perhaps 30 years ago when the house was rewired for electricity. It leads, I would guess, to the old gunroom behind the library." He stepped inside. I followed, stooping. The passage smelled of dust and candle smoke. 10 paces brought us to a second panel, which opened with the pressure of Poirot's shoulder into the gunroom itself. From there, a baize door gave directly onto the main corridor. "Anyone in the house could have used this route," I said. "Exactly. And anyone could have carried the prepared decanter through, set it upon the desk, and retreated the same way. The Viscount, absorbed in his letters, would notice nothing until he poured his nightcap. The door remained bolted, the windows fastened, the secret panel undisturbed, because no one thought to look for it. We returned to the study. Poirot closed the bookshelf with a soft click. "Yet one detail still troubles Poirot," he said, almost to himself. "The odor of bitter almonds was strong when the door was broken down at 9 o'clock the following morning, 10 hours after death. Prussic acid is volatile. The scent should have dissipated. Someone, mon ami, reopened this room during the night to renew the perfume of murder." He stood motionless for a long moment, then suddenly clapped his hands with a sharp report that made me jump. "But of course, the murderer returned not to add poison, but to remove evidence, the empty file, perhaps, or the true suicide note. In the dark, he overturned the glass, spilled brandy on the sill, and in his haste left us the thread from his glove and the second scrap burning in the fire. He turned to me, eyes blazing. Tomorrow, Hastings, we set the trap. Tomorrow the murderer will return again, this time into the open jaws of Hercule Poirot. Outside, the wind dropped as suddenly as it had risen. In the hush, I heard, faint and far off, the sound of a woman weeping behind a locked door. The scent of bitter almonds lingered in the room like an unquiet ghost. Chapter 5. The Daughter's Secret. The house slept, or pretended to. Clocks ticked in distant corridors. Floorboards settled with the slow sigh of centuries. And somewhere a fox barked beneath the library windows. At 2:30 in Toy, the morning Poirot and I sat in darkness on the narrow staircase that led from the gunroom to the secret passage, wrapped in overcoats, against the chill that rose from the stone. A thin blade of light showed beneath the study door. Someone was inside. Poirot's hand closed on my wrist, steady, warning. We waited. After an eternity, measured in heartbeats, the bookshelf moved a fraction, no more than the width of a hand. A gloved finger appeared, feeling for the edge. Then the panel opened wider, and a figure slipped through. The candle the intruder carried threw a wavering circle of gold across the carpet. A woman in a dark dressing gown, hair loose about her shoulders, face pale as paper. Delia Frost. She went straight to the desk, set the candle down, and began to search with quick, frightened movements, opening drawers, running her fingers along the underside of the blotter, even lifting the corners of the turkey rug. Twice she froze, listening, but the house remained silent. At last she found what she sought, a small drawer I had not noticed before, concealed behind the leather writing surface. From it, she drew a folded sheet and a tiny glass vial, empty, its cork sealed with red wax. She was turning toward the fireplace, plainly intending to burn the paper, when Poirot rose like a shadow, detaching itself from the wall, and spoke one soft word. Mademoiselle. Delia gave a single, choked cry. The candle fell, rolled, and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I heard the scratch of a match, and then Poirot's steady flame illuminated the scene. The girl pressed back against the desk, eyes enormous, the file and paper clutched to her breast. No, no, do not fear, Poirot said gently. I have no wish to harm you, only to understand. Come, let us have light. He relit the fallen candle, placed it in its stick, and drew forward a chair. After a moment, Delia sank into it. As though her legs had given way, tears began to course silently down her cheeks. Poirot took the objects from her unresisting fingers. The paper was a letter in the Viscount's handwriting, dated the day of his death. My dearest child, if you read this, I shall have failed in my duty to protect you. Know that I have taken the only course left to a man of honor. Clarissa has been poisoning me, slowly arsenic in the port, night after night. The doctors would call it gastritis. She would inherit everything, and you nothing. I cannot allow that. Tonight I shall end the matter swiftly with the cyanide Dr. Ravencroft keeps for his wasps. The room will be locked, the appearance of murder complete. An insurance policy of £100,000 taken out last month and payable only upon proof of foul play names you sole beneficiary. The police will seek a murderer. They will find none, and you will be safe. Forgive me for leaving you, but a father's love sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice. Burn this when you have read it. Your loving Papa Poirot folded the letter with reverence and returned it to her. And the file? He asked. Delia's voice was barely a thread. He meant me to find it earlier. He told me in the afternoon there was something hidden in the secret drawer that would explain everything. But after he died, I was too terrified. Lady Clarissa watched me every moment. Tonight, I could bear the uncertainty no longer. Poirot studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You are a good daughter, mademoiselle. Your father chose well. But tell me, when Grimshaw brought the single glass of brandy at 11, was the decanter already upon the desk? She shook her head. No. Papa poured his own nightcap from the library decanter after Grimshaw left. He locked the door, then opened the secret panel and called softly to me. I was waiting in the gun room. He gave me the pearl from his stick pin and said, "Whatever happens, remember I love you." Then he drank. He knew exactly what it would do. He smiled at me through the gap in the bookshelf and said, "Close it now, little one. Let no one find the passage." I obeyed. I heard him bolt the door from inside. Then there was a terrible sound, like a man strangling, and then silence. Her voice broke entirely. Poirot laid a hand upon her shoulder with extraordinary gentleness. "You have carried this alone for 2 days. It is enough." He helped her to her feet. "Come. You will drink hot milk with a little brandy, good brandy this time, and sleep. Tomorrow the truth will be told, and your father's last wish granted." As we led her toward the door, she turned suddenly. Lady Clarissa, she really was poisoning him. Oui. A few white grains in the port every evening for months. The symptoms exactly those of chronic gastritis. Dr. Ravencroft suspected, but lacked courage to accuse her. Your father's dramatic gesture saved you and exposed her at one stroke. At the threshold, Delia paused again, looking back at the desk where the dead man had sat. He was smiling, she whispered. Even at the end, Poirot bowed his head. Then he died content, mademoiselle. Few of us are granted that mercy. We left the study together, closing the door softly upon the scent of bitter almonds that would, by morning, have faded into memory. Behind us, the candle burned steadily, a small, steady star in a room where justice, at last, had been served by the hand of the victim himself. Chapter 6. The Final Reconstruction. Dawn crept over Ashford Manor in a wash of pale gold and gunmetal grey, the kind of light that makes every leaf look newly minted and every shadow guilty. In the great hall, the long case clock struck 7 with the solemn authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. Poirot had summoned every soul who had been beneath this roof on the night of the murder. Lady Clarissa, in a black morning gown that made her look more like a tragic queen than a poisoner. Dr. Ravencroft, haggard and unshaven. Reggie Thorne, still in't. Evening dress, and smelling of the brandy he had used to steady his nerves. Grimshaw, upright as a grenadier. And Delia Frost, pale but composed, wrapped in a dark cloak that swallowed her slight figure. Inspector Japp stood beside the staircase with 2 sergeants, notebooks ready. Poirot took his place beneath the minstrel gallery, hands clasped behind his back, the morning light catching the silver threads in his moustaches until they glittered like frost. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice ringing clear against the vaulted beams, "we have reached the moment of truth. For 2 days you have watched Hercule Poirot search for a murderer who could enter a bolted room, poison a man, and vanish like smoke. You have each, in your hearts, cherished the hope that the crime was impossible, and therefore would remain forever unsolved. I am here to disappoint you." He turned first to Lady Clarissa. "Madame, 6 months ago you began to administer arsenic to your husband in his after-dinner port. A few grains each evening, no more than would produce the symptoms of gastritis. You were clever. You persuaded Dr. Ravencroft that his lordship suffered from chronic dyspepsia, and the good doctor, who had been borrowing from the estate for years and feared exposure, prescribed increasing doses of laudanum to ease the pain he himself had helped to create. In 3 or 4 months, Lord Ashford would have died quietly. The doctors would have shaken their heads over a mysterious wasting disease, and you, Madame, would have inherited everything. Lady Clarissa lifted her chin, eyes blazing defiance, but said nothing. Unfortunately for you, his lordship was not quite the fool you believed. He consulted another physician in London in strictest confidence. Tests upon his hair and nails revealed the presence of arsenic. He understood everything. Divorce was impossible without scandal that would ruin his daughter's future. He chose instead a course both desperate and magnificent. Poirot's gaze swept the room. On the afternoon of his death, he took out an insurance policy for £100,000, payable only if his death were proved to be murder, never suicide. He rewrote his will, leaving everything unentailed to Miss Delia Frost, witnessed by Grimshaw and Mrs. Danvers. Then he prepared the stage. He obtained cyanide from Dr. Ravencroft's dispensary easy enough, since the doctor was in terror of him. He filled the old Regency decanter with brandy and added the poison. He wrote 2 letters, one to his solicitor announcing justice for his daughter, one to Delia explaining everything and begging her to burn it after reading. At 11 o'clock, Grimshaw brought the usual single glass from the library decanter. Lord Ashford dismissed him, locked and bolted the door, opened the secret panel, and handed his daughter the pearl from his stick-pin as a keepsake. Then he closed the panel, poured from the poisoned decanter, and drank. A low sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped Delia. He knew death would come within seconds. He arranged himself at the desk so that the scene would appear exactly as a murderer would wish it to appear. The agony was brief. By the time the cyanide had done its work, the door was bolted, the windows fastened, the secret passage unknown to any save himself and his daughter. The perfect locked-room murder committed by the victim. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch until it was unbearable. Lady Clarissa, your slow poison would have been discovered at the post-mortem in any case. By choosing prussic acid, your husband ensured that the police would look for an external murderer, and finding none, would arrest you for the arsenic already in his system. The insurance policy would pay, the new will would stand, and his daughter would be safe forever. He turned to Dr. Ravencroft. You, doctor, suspected the arsenic but lacked the courage to speak. You are accessory after the fact to attempted murder, but I think Scotland Yard will be content with your striking off the register. Ravencroft seemed to shrink inside his clothes. Reggie Thorne gave a shaky laugh. Good God, Uncle Harold topped himself to spite us all. There's style for you. Poirot ignored him and faced Lady Clarissa directly. Madame, the game is finished. You will be charged with the attempted murder of your husband by arsenical poisoning. The fact that he forestalled you by his own hand alters nothing in law. Inspector Japp. Japp stepped forward, the handcuffs glinting in his hand. Lady Clarissa looked once at Delia, a look of such pure hatred that I felt the air itself grow colder, then held out her wrists without a word. The steel closed with a small final click. As she was led away, Delia sank to her knees on the checkered marble, tears streaming down her face. Poirot went to her, raised her gently, and placed the pearl stick-pin in her palm. Your father's last gift, mademoiselle. Keep it always. He died as he lived with courage and with love. Outside, the sun broke fully over the park, gilding the ancient oaks and turning the dew to diamonds. Somewhere a blackbird began to sing, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for 2 days and could at last exhale. The scent of bitter almonds was gone forever, carried away on the morning wind. Chapter 7. The Viscount's Last Breath. 2 hours later, the house stood almost empty. The police vans had gone, taking Lady Clarissa in one and Dr. Ravenscroft in another, the latter weeping quietly, the former sitting bolt upright, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the windows. Reggie Thorne had been driven to the station by a sympathetic constable who understood that a man may be a wastrel without being a murderer, and who had promised to put him on the first train to Southampton and a boat to anywhere that was not England. Grimshaw, impassive as ever, was directing 2 footmen in the solemn business of drawing dust sheets over the furniture. The great public rooms would be closed until the new mistress chose otherwise. Poirot and I lingered in the study where it had all begun. The body had been removed at last, the desk cleared of its tragic litter, the windows thrown open to the sweet October air. Only the faint stain on the blotter and the darker one on the carpet remained as witnesses. Poirot stood at the French doors, looking out over the terrace toward the lake, hands clasped behind his back, the wind lifting the curls at his temples. "You are pensive, my friend," I said. He turned, and for once the famous smile was absent. Pensive, perhaps. It is not every day that Hercule Poirot is utterly defeated, Hastings. "Defeated?" I cried. "But you solved everything. The locked room, the poison, the secret passage, the motive, everything. Lady Clarissa is in custody. The innocent are free. Justice is done." He shook his head slowly. "Justice? No. A father is dead by his own hand. A daughter is left with a fortune stained by that death. And a wife, however guilty, will hang for a murder she did not in fact commit. Where is the justice in that?" He crossed to the desk and touched the place where the poisoned glass had stood. "Consider the exquisite irony. Lord Ashford desired above all to protect his child. To do so, he staged a murder so perfect that the law must now execute an innocent woman for it innocent, that is, of the crime of which she is accused. The arsenic would never have been enough to convict. The doctors would have called it gastritis. Only the prussic acid, administered by his own hand, made murder certain in the eyes of the jury. He condemned Clarissa to the gallows to save Delia from the workhouse. Mon Dieu, what a triumph of paternal love. I had no answer. The morning seemed suddenly colder. Poirot went on, almost to himself. I could have kept silent. I could have declared the death suicide, allowed the insurance to be contested and lost, let Clarissa walk free with her jointure and her reputation. But no Poirot is bound by the truth. And the truth is that she attempted murder for months. The law will call it murder frustrated by suicide. The newspapers will call it the Ashford poison drama. And somewhere, a girl of 25 will wake every morning for the rest of her life, knowing that her father died, choking in agony, so that she might never want for anything. He drew a long breath. There are cases, Hastings, where the solution is more terrible than the crime. This is one. Delia appeared in the doorway, dressed now in simple black, the pearl stickpin gleaming at her throat. She carried a small leather jewel case. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "the solicitors are here from London. They say everything is mine, the house, the investments, the insurance when it is paid. I do not want any of it. I want only to give you this." She opened the case. Inside, on black velvet, lay a check drawn on Coots for £10,000. "Papa kept a fund for emergencies. Please take it for your work and for those who have no one else to solve their mysteries." Poirot closed the lid with gentle finality. "You honor me, mademoiselle, but Hercule Poirot does not accept payment when the result is so bitter. Keep your father's money. Use it to make the world a little less cruel than it was to him. That would be the gift he would most wish." Her eyes filled, but she did not weep. Instead, she came forward, and to my astonishment, kissed Poirot lightly on both cheeks. "Then I will found a home for children who have no fathers," she said. "It will be called the Harold Ashford Refuge, and every year on the anniversary of his death, I will place bitter almond blossoms on his grave so that no one ever forgets how love can taste." Poirot bowed over her hand with the grace of a courtier. "That is a memorial worthy of any man." She left us then, walking down the long corridor with a steadiness that belied her youth. We watched until she turned the corner toward the morning room where the lawyers waited. Poirot picked up his hat and cane. "Come, Hastings, there is nothing more for us here." As we stepped onto the terrace, the sun broke fully from behind a cloud, flooding the park with sudden warmth. Far off, the church bells of Ashford Village began to ring, not the slow tolling of a funeral, but the bright peal that announces a baptism or a wedding. Poirot paused, listening. "Life goes on," he said softly. "It always does. Even when the heart is broken, the clocks keep ticking, the swallows return, and somewhere a child is born who will never know the price that was paid for its happiness." He raised his hat toward the house in a small private salute. "Adieu, Lord Ashford. You played your last hand with courage. May you find beyond the grave the peace that was denied you in this room." We walked slowly down the drive beneath the turning beeches. Behind us, Ashford Manor stood silent, already half in mourning, half in hope. And on the study desk, where no one would ever see it, a single late rose had been laid its petals the exact pale pink of a pearl, its heart still wet with morning dew. Chapters 8. Epilogue. The Taste of Almonds. A year later, almost to the day, Poirot and I found ourselves again in Surrey. The occasion was not another murder, thank heaven, but the quiet opening of the Harold Ashford Refuge for Fatherless Children. A low, graceful building of red brick and white stone that had risen on the southern edge of the estate, where the old dower house once stood. Delia Frost, now simply Miss Ashford, for the solicitors had made the adoption. Retrospective had pulled down the gloomy Victorian pile and replaced it with something light, airy, and deliberately unpretentious. Long windows that caught the sun, a walled garden where even the youngest could dig without danger, a nursery painted the color of primroses. We arrived in the late afternoon. Children were already running across the lawns, some in wheelchairs, pushed by smiling nurses, others racing on sturdy legs that had never known a father's hand. Their laughter rose like birdsong above the clipped yew hedges. Delia met us at the gate. She wore a plain grey dress and no jewelry save the pearl stickpin at her throat. Yet there was a steadiness in her eyes that had not been there before. "You came?" she said simply, and kissed Poirot on both cheeks as naturally as though he were an uncle returned from abroad. "How could I not?" Poirot replied, twinkling. "When a young lady writes that she has named the library after Hercule Poirot, even my modesty must bow before such an honor." She laughed the first unshadowed laugh I had ever heard from her, and led us through the hall, where a brass plate already gleamed, the Hercule Poirot Library. May truth and kindness dwell here together. In the garden, a small ceremony had been arranged. A few local dignitaries, the matron, the children gathered in a half circle. Delia spoke briefly. She did not mention poison, or locked rooms, or the terrible night when her father drank death for her sake. She spoke only of a man who had believed that no child should pay for the accidents of birth, and of a promise kept beyond the grave. When she cut the ribbon across the new front door, the children cheered, and a small boy with bright red hair presented Poirot with a posy tied with a ribbon, the exact green of his famous waistcoat. Afterwards, we walked alone with Delia beneath an avenue of limes just beginning to turn gold. "You look well, ma petite," Poirot said. "I sleep," she answered. "That is the miracle. For months, I woke every night tasting almonds. Now I wake tasting only the air." She stopped beside a marble bench set beneath a tree. On it lay a single spray of white flowers, delicate, waxy, unmistakable. "Winter flowering cherry," she said softly. "The scent is almost, but not quite, like bitter almonds. I planted it the day the builders left. Every spring it will blossom here, and every spring I will remember that love can be poisonous, and that poison can sometimes be love. The children will simply think it is pretty." Poirot studied the tree for a long moment. "You have made beauty out of bitterness," he said at last. "Your father would be content." Delia turned to him, eyes suddenly bright. "Do you think so? Sometimes I am afraid he would hate what I have done, selling the London house, letting the great park to farmers, turning his study into a dormitory. But then I remember his letter. Use it to make the world a little less cruel. I think this is what he meant." Poirot took her hand and pressed it. He meant exactly this. The sun was sinking now, gilding the rooftops of the new building and turning the windows into sheets of flame. Somewhere inside, a child began to sing a simple nursery tune about stars and sheep. The sound drifted across the garden, pure and unafraid. Poirot released her hand and stepped back. "Come, Hastings," he said briskly. "We have trespassed long enough upon private happiness. There is a train to Waterloo at 6:30, and I have promised myself an omelette aux fines herbes at my own table tonight." As we walked toward the gate, Delia called after us. "Monsieur Poirot," he turned. "Thank you," she said, "for the truth, even when it hurt." Poirot bowed, very low. "The truth always hurts, mademoiselle, but it is the only thing that heals." The Napier carried us smoothly back toward London, through lanes already dim with twilight. Poirot was unusually silent until we reached the outskirts of Leatherhead. "You know, Hastings," he said suddenly, "in every life there comes a moment when one must choose between justice and mercy. Most of us never notice the moment pass. Lord Ashford noticed. He chose mercy for his child, paid for with his life and with his wife's ruin. I, who pride myself on serving only justice, was merely the messenger." He leaned back against the leather and closed his eyes. Sometimes I wonder which of us was the greater detective. Darkness gathered as we crossed the Thames. The lights of London began to prick out along the embankment like early stars. I glanced at my friend. His face was quiet, almost serene. In the pocket of his overcoat, I knew he still carried the little enamel box in which reposed, wrapped in cotton wool, the single pearl that had fallen from a dying man's stick-pin. He had never told Delia he kept it. Some truths, after all, are better left unspoken. And somewhere behind us, in a quiet Surrey garden, a white tree lifted its arms to the coming winter, carrying upon the night air the faintest ghost of almonds, no longer bitter, but strangely, impossibly sweet. Chapter 9. The Almond Tree in Winter 5. More years slipped by, as quietly as pages turned by an unseen hand. Europe marched toward the abyss. Newspapers screamed of Anschluss and Munich, of tanks rolling across borders. Yet in the sheltered corner of Surrey, where the Harold Ashford refuge stood, time moved to a gentler rhythm marked by children's birthdays, by the first snowdrop and the last swallow. Poirot had grown frailer. The magnificent moustache was now snow white, the famous egg-shaped head a little more sunken at the temples, yet the eyes remained bright, and the little grey cells, he assured me daily, were as active as ever. He had retired, officially, to a small house in the country, not 20 miles from the refuge, tended by a devoted Belgian couple, and visited every Thursday by a London specialist, who shook his head and prescribed more rest. Poirot ignored the prescriptions, and instead cultivated prize vegetable marrows that took first place at every village show. On a February afternoon in 1939, when the sky hung low and iron grey, and the threat of war felt closer than the next hedgerow, a plain black motor car turned in at the refuge gates. The children, muffled in coats and scarves, were playing some complicated game of tigers and explorers on the frozen lawn. They stopped to stare as the passenger stepped out, small, immaculate, leaning only lightly on a Malacca cane. Delia Ashford, no longer the frightened girl of the locked study, but a woman of 30, with quiet authority in every line, came running from the front door, skirts flying, and embraced Poirot, as though he were the prodigal instead of the visitor. "You promised you would come when the almond tree flowered," she said, laughing and crying at once. "It has flowered in February, a whole month early. I knew it was a sign." She led him by the hand along the gravel path to the winter garden. There, against the south wall, where the old dower house chimney had once stood, the little tree had burst into reckless blossom. Hundreds of pale shells trembled against the dark branches, and the air impossibly, defiantly carried the ghost of spring. Poirot stood beneath it for a long time, hat in hand, the pale petals drifting onto his shoulders like snow. "It remembers," he murmured. Delia nodded. "Every year it flowers earlier. The children call it the Snow King. They hang paper lanterns in its branches on the anniversary February the 12th. They think it is magic." She hesitated. "Sometimes I almost believe them." A bell rang from the house supper, lessons, the small orderly rituals that keep terror at bay. The children scattered, shouting promises to save the best cake for Monsieur Poirot. We were left alone beneath the tree. Delia drew a letter from her pocket, much creased. The ink faded to brown. "I found this among Papa's papers only last month," she said. "It was addressed to you, but never posted. He must have written it the very afternoon he died." She gave it to Poirot. The envelope was heavy vellum, sealed long ago with black wax. Inside, in the Viscount's firm, decisive hand, "My dear Monsieur Poirot, if chance or destiny ever brings you to Ashford Manor again, I beg you to walk beneath the winter-flowering cherry that grows beside the old study wall. I planted 30 years ago, the day my daughter was born in secret. Its scent is almost, but not quite, the scent of bitter almonds. I have always thought of it as a reminder that what seems poison may, in time, become perfume. Should I fail to greet you myself, believe that I died content, knowing the future is safe in better hands than mine." With profound respect, Harold Ashford Poirot read it twice, very slowly, then folded the sheet and placed it inside his waistcoat, over his heart. Your father, he said at last, was a man of rare perception. He understood that endings are merely doors disguised as walls. Delia brushed a petal from his sleeve. I have kept one room exactly as it was, she confessed. The study. I could not bear to change it. The children are forbidden to play there. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit at the desk and try to feel him still writing. Do you think that is foolish? Poirot's smile was luminous. On the contrary, ma chère, it is the most natural thing in the world. The dead do not leave us so long as we refuse to close the door behind them. He looked up at the tree again. A single petal drifted down and settled on the brim of his hat like a blessing. You know, he said conversationally, I have decided to write my memoirs. Not the cases everyone expects, the grand murders, the famous acquittals, but the quiet ones. The ones where love, not hate, moved the hand that held the poison. This will be the final chapter. Delia's eyes widened. You will tell the truth? Every word. Names changed, of course, to protect the living. But the truth, yes. The world should know that a man once drank cyanide so that his child might never taste poverty. It is a better legacy than any fortune. Snow began to fall then, soft and deliberate, the first flakes of the coming storm. They settled on the blossoms without crushing them, turning the tree into a miracle of white against white. Delia slipped her arm through Poirot's. Come inside. The children have made you a crown of paper almonds. They insist you wear it at tea. Poirot laughed, the old delighted laugh I had not heard in months. Lead on, Your Majesty. Hercule Poirot is never prouder than when he is decorated by the young. As they walked away beneath the gently falling snow, the almond tree stood alone, petals drifting to the ground like pale confessions. Somewhere in its branches, a small bird began to sing, unafraid of the coming winter, certain as only the very young and the very old can be certain that spring always returns. And high above them both, in the locked study that was no longer locked in anything but memory, a single shaft of winter sunlight struck the exact spot where a poisoned glass had once stood, and for a moment the air shimmered with the faintest, sweetest scent of almonds no longer bitter but impossibly eternally alive. Chapter 10. The Last Little Grey Cell. The war came as everyone had known it would. In September 1939, the almond tree at the refuge dropped its leaves early, as though it too understood that childhood was being cancelled for the duration. Children arrived from London with labels round their necks and gas masks in cardboard boxes. The dormitories filled, the gardens were dug for vegetables, and the study, Papa's study, became a makeshift air raid shelter with bunks and a tin of biscuits and a wind-up gramophone that played Run, Rabbit, Run when the siren sounded. Poirot refused to leave England. He told the Home Office, with exquisite politeness, that Hercule Poirot had fled Belgium once before in 1914 and had no intention of repeating the performance. Instead, he moved into a cottage on the edge of the refuge grounds, ostensibly to advise on the growing of marrows under wartime conditions. In reality, so that he could watch over the almond tree and the woman who tended it. He grew thinner, the famous moustache now a white banner of defiance. Yet every morning at 11, he walked the gravel path to the tree, cane tapping, overcoat buttoned to the throat against the east wind. Children trailed after him like ducklings, begging for stories of impossible murders. He told them instead about a man who loved his daughter so much that he turned poison into perfume, and they listened wide-eyed, never quite understanding, yet somehow comforted all the same. On the 10th anniversary of the Viscount's death, February 12th, 1946. The war was over, the children were going home or staying forever, and the almond tree flowered as it had never flowed before, a white fountain against the raw winter sky. Poirot, now 81 and moving like a man made of porcelain, insisted on walking there alone. Delia watched from the window, anxious, but did not follow. She had learned to respect the silences of the two men who had shaped her life. He reached the tree slowly, removed his hat, and stood beneath the branches while petals drifted onto his shoulders like the softest snowfall. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, so quietly that only the tree could hear, he spoke in French. Eh bien, mon ami, 10 years. Your little one is safe. The world tried to destroy itself, but here, children laugh again. You chose well. He reached into his waistcoat and drew out the small enamel box he had carried since 1936. Opening it, he took the single pearl still luminous after all this time and pressed it gently into a crevice, low in the trunk where the bark had split years before. A place for everything, he murmured, and everything in its place. A bell rang from the house, tea, lessons, the small orderly rituals that had survived even war. Poirot turned to go, then paused. A final petal settled on his palm. He studied it gravely, as though it were the last clue in the last case. Love, he said to the empty air, is the only poison for which there is no antidote, and the only one worth drinking. He did not return to the cottage that evening. Instead, they found him at dusk, seated on the marble bench beneath the tree, hat neatly on his knees, hands folded over the malacca cane, eyes closed, the faintest smile upon his lips. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and deliberate, covering the white blossoms so that tree and man seemed carved from the same pure marble. Delia came running, children behind her, nurses, cooks, everyone who had ever been touched by the refuge. She knelt, took his hand. It was still warm, and understood at once that the little grey cells had simply politely stopped. There was no fuss. Poirot had left precise instructions. No embalming, no lying in state, only a plain oak coffin and burial at the foot of the almond tree. Where I may continue, he wrote, to keep an eye on things. The Home Secretary offered Westminster Abbey. The Belgian ambassador offered Liège. Delia refused both. On a cold, bright morning in late February, the village came with spades and hymns, and they laid Hercule Poirot to rest exactly where he wished, beneath the branches that would flower for him every year long, after the name Ashford Manor was forgotten. Delia placed no headstone, only a small plaque let into the bench. Here lies Hercule Poirot, who believed that truth, like love, is worth any price, and that some poisons turn in time to perfume. Years later, when Delia herself was old and the refuge had become a great foundation stretching across continents, children still asked why the almond tree flowered in winter and why the little Belgian gentleman slept beneath it. The older ones told the story differently each time, of a locked room, of a father's last drink, of a detective who solved the hardest case of all by understanding that some murders are committed out of perfect love. And on certain February nights, when the moon is full and the frost lies thick, those who walk the garden path swear they catch the faintest scent of almonds. Not bitter now, but sweet as forgiveness, and hear, very softly, the tap of a malacca cane on gravel, and the satisfied murmur of a small man with magnificent moustaches, saying, "Eh bien, it is accomplished. Order and method, always order and method. The tree flowers still, the bench waits, and somewhere, in whatever place tidy minds go, when the last little grey cell has given its final spark, Hercule Poirot smiles, twirls an impeccable moustache, and knows that the very last case, the one that mattered most, was solved not by deduction, but by the oldest and simplest motive in the world."